Welcome to Books in Review. I'm your host, Cheryl Nason, and I can't wait to introduce you to the man who's seated beside me here on the couch. He probably needs no introduction. His name is Phil Vinson, and we're going to talk about his book, It Takes a Worried Man. Phil, hi.
Hi, Cheryl.
You've been a Fort Worth person for a long time.
Most of my life, yes.
And you've been in the newspaper business for a long time.
Yes, more or less.
And that really sort of is what It Takes a Worried Man rotates around. Let's give our viewers just a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what the book's about.
It's about a young newspaper man in his mid-20s, out of college a couple of years, and he's very talented, and his superiors think a lot of his work, and he is hoping to become an editor, and he finally is offered a job as an editor, a city editor in Galveston. He takes the job and has been there several months when an old personal demon flares up. He has suffered from anxiety disorder, and he's had panic attacks in the past, but he thought he was all over that. And then they flare up again at the worst time in the world, because his old girlfriend, who he hadn't seen in 2 years, appears on the scene. And so he's fraught with this conflict between, you know, how does he renew his relationship with Susie and deal with this personal issue that he's got. And he figures that he's dated Susie before, but he never told her about his problem. And so he has this big issue of whether to tell her or not. And so he figures that once he tells her, that'll probably run her off, that'll probably be the end of it. But he tells her, and as it turns out, she's studying to be a psychiatric nurse, and she's very understanding about the whole thing and says, don't worry about it. You love somebody, you deal with it. So, you know, they go from there. But then as a newspaper man, as a city editor of the newspaper in Galveston, he becomes involved in a local scandal. The paper uncovers some hanky-panky by the local police chief and police department and the district attorney, and Greg is in the position of having to direct the coverage of this scandal. Because a very prominent citizen has beat a young child to death, and the police, because he's so influential, because he's a rich guy, the police lay off. They don't want to charge him with a crime, and so the paper is in the position of having to deal with this scandal and expose, you know, the wrongdoing in the situation. And it proves to be too much for Greg. He is under so much pressure that he can't stand it, and his panic attacks return in full force, and he ends up in the hospital, and things just go in a cycle downward, and finally everything falls apart. Susie has had enough. She can't take any more. And so Greg is at his wit's end about what to do. And one of the points that I try to make is that the book takes place in the 60s. And at that time, the medical profession didn't really have a good understanding of how to treat anxiety and depression at that time.
How did you do your research, Phil? Because I know this is not you that we're talking about.
Some of it is me.
Really? Do you suffer from panic attacks, or did you
I don't
at one
anymore,
time?
but I did. Yes.
So that's where you got the idea.
That's where I got
this
the
to
idea.
The character.
Yeah. The idea came. I'd written another book 3 years ago called Ink in the Blood, which was a nonfiction. It was a memoir about growing up in Fort Worth and so forth, and in the 50s. And I was toying with the idea of writing a sequel to that, continuing the story on beyond my college years, and on into the 60s and so forth. And I tried writing it that way, and it was factual, but it just wasn't as good, because I mean it was it was too personal for one thing, and I just got too close to it, and I didn't want to have to deal with my own personal issues. So I thought, well, maybe I can do a novel, a fictional story, and embellish the facts a little bit and make it more interesting. My goal in writing the book was, number one, to write an entertaining book.
And you did.
And the second goal was to be informative about people who suffer from anxiety problems.
In the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, it was not well understood,
No.
and you're exactly right when you say that you didn't want anybody to know.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
and Greg really struggles
Right.
with telling people.
Right.
And
He
his
does.
mother is not supportive.
No,
his
his
father's
mother.
great, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
it's really hard for him, and he befriends one of the psychiatrists that he goes to is really good, and then you get into all the stuff with the over-medication and all that business.
Yeah.
Wow, that was hard.
Yes. It's hard for anybody, but it's easier when nowadays it's more out in the open and
I agree.
more easily discussed than it was then. But then it was a burden, and it was a struggle. But Greg meets, finally, as a last resort, he hears about a woman in Amarillo, of all places, who has been having remarkable success treating people with anxiety disorders. And so he finds a way to get up to the Panhandle where she is, and she helps him enormously, and he basically gets his life back together.
You know, now we understand so much more from a medical standpoint about the things that go on with our brain and about stress. I mean, so much of what happened to Greg was triggered by the fact that he was under so much stress and he didn't know what to do with it.
Right, right. And he didn't know who to trust. He didn't know who to tell about it, and it was just an ongoing struggle for him until he finally saw some obvious things about it. One of the things that Marilyn Reed, the doctor that he saw in Amarillo, pointed out, he says in one passage, "That sounds like common sense." And she says, "Yeah, common sense works." And a lot of it is common sense. I think that the conflict in the medical profession, I think this still exists, is the nature-nurture dichotomy, that how much of it is caused by your environment and your background, how much is it caused by the chemicals in your brain and so forth. And I think one of the things that Greg finds out from Marilyn is that the Freudian approach to treating anxiety problems doesn't always work, because it's more of a chemical reaction than it is based on your past. So Marilyn Reed, the doctor in Amarillo, has him do some things that help him to recognize when it's basically, panic is caused by adrenaline. And adrenaline, you get a rush of adrenaline, and the doctors today call it second fear. You react to the adrenaline, and more adrenaline is released. And you react to that, and more adrenaline is released, and finally you're just in a state of panic.
You get in that circle, that cycle.
And there are some medications that can help with that, but also the method that I pointed out in the book is that when